Okay, we'd like to welcome everybody to our Lunch and Learn this Tuesday, and we hope this is something that will become part of everyone's schedule. At 12 o'clock on Tuesdays, to have the opportunity to study something together, to learn together a little bit, and to find ways to inspire us to keep growing and to just keep elevating ourselves and our Avodas Hashem. And there are many ways to do it in terms of studying the Parsha and studying different types of personality traits. And I think the theme that we're going to really be focusing on are really different ways to try to elevate our service to Hashem in some way. And sometimes it'll be from the Parsha, sometimes it'll be from the Midrashim, sometimes from other sources. But the theme is really finding ways, practical ways to look into ourselves and look for ways to really improve our relationships, whether it be with Hashem, with each other, and of course, understanding ourselves in the process. So today's shiur, we're going to look at Moshe Rabbeinu and really ask ourselves a very important question about the life of Moshe. And we'll look at his biography a little bit and perhaps see things that will be very important for us to understand how we have to view ourselves. There's a major question that's discussed in the Mefarshim, and something I think which crosses our minds as well when we think about Moshe, is why did Moshe Rabbeinu have to grow up in the palace of Paro? The leader of the Jewish nation, the one who's going to stand on Har Sinai and receive the Torah for us, his background seems to be a little bit strange, that here he is, he grows up where? In the house of the Paro who ends up being the oppressor of the Jewish nation. And the question why he has to go up there is something I think which we certainly all ask and think about at many points. And I'd like to share with everyone today a beautiful piece from the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra is one of the major commentaries on the Chumash, written in Spain, I believe around the 1200s. And the Ibn Ezra asks this question, and he gives three answers. The question being, why did Moshe Rabbeinu have to grow up in the house of Paro? So he says as follows. The Ibn Ezra says, really answering that question, he says like this, that Makshavos Hashem Amko. First of all, we have to understand that the thoughts of Hashem are so deep. Who really can understand the secrets of Hashem. And he says that by way of introduction because when we think about it, the question is really overwhelming. That Moshe Rabbeinu, the leader of the Jewish nation, is growing up where? In the house of the enemy, as it were. So he begins his piece by saying that Makshavos Hashem Amku Miyochel Amod B'Sodo. Thoughts of Hashem are so deep, and who could possibly try to fathom and understand the depth of Hashem's plan? But with that said, he says, V'lu levad nischano lilos, but maybe we could find some paths. He says, Ulai, perhaps, Saviv Hashem zesh yigdal Moshe bebeis hamalchus, there's nafshu madrega oyona b'derech halimud v'ragilus. The first thing he offers is that Moshe needed to grow up in the house of Paro. Why? In order to have a limud, to learn something there. What did he need to learn in the house of Paro? He needed to learn really his life's mission. His life's mission was to be a leader of the Jewish nation. And what better place to learn leadership than in the home of the most powerful leader of the world, Paro. So Hashem orchestrating the life of Moshe allows him to grow up where? Exactly where he needs to be in order to fulfill his life's mission. If his life's mission is leadership, his life's mission is to be the one to guide a nation, develop a nation, to be that leader who he was, what better place than the home of the greatest leader of the generation, the home of Paro. So I think just as an aside, I think that's an important message for us, an important observation just on its own, that really we have to understand that every circumstance that Hashem gives us in life, wherever Hashem places us, or whatever our background might be, it's exactly what we need in order to fulfill our mission and our purpose. And to never look at one's life situation or one's background and say, had it been different, or if only it were different, I think this is a classic example and a model where Hashem places us precisely where we need in order to fulfill what our unique mission is in life. And for Moshe Rabbeinu to be a leader, what better place than to grow up in the house of Paro, a place where we can learn leadership. And I think if we look at our own lives and we just look into ourselves a little bit and we think about it, and we ask ourselves, why did Hashem place me in a certain home, a certain family, in a certain community, a certain background? We have to, I think we don't have to look too far to discover it must be because that's the way I'm going to fulfill my unique mission in this world and as part of the Jewish people. So reason number one, which the Ibn Ezra offers, is this beautiful idea that he had to grow up in the house of Paro. Why? Because what better place but to learn leadership than the house of the most powerful leader in the world? He gives two more reasons. I'm going to jump to the third and then go back to the second. And the third reason is, V'od davar acher, ki ilo haya godol bein achov. Had he grown up in a community of his brothers and sisters and fellow Jews, v'yakiru mei le'urav, they would recognize him from his past, from his youth, v'lo hayirei mimenu, and they wouldn't have such awe of him. Ki yachshavu ki echem mehem, he would have thought you're one of us. Interesting. Moshe Rabbeinu's position and his importance and his role in the Jewish community really required that people look at him and have an awesome degree of respect for him, and really understood that he's somebody to emulate and to respect. And had he grown up amongst them, he might have lost that respect on some level, because they would have said, he grew up with us, we know him, we remember him from his past. I think we all know this, when people achieve a certain degree of greatness, or they grow in Torah, or they become different types of people, and there's a tendency to look back at that person and say, I remember him when he was a kid. I remember when he was in high school. I remember what he used to do when he was young. And maybe we tend to do that because we don't want to attribute such greatness to the person, or maybe we do that because sometimes it's just difficult to see that a person has really grown and really achieved. In order for Moshe Rabbeinu to fulfill his unique role, people had to look at him and see him with a tremendous degree of respect and awe. And for that reason, he had to grow up in a way which is really separate from the community. I think, just by way of an aside on that point, I think it's such an important idea that the Torah is trying to communicate to us something, that when people grow and when they change and when they move on, perhaps they become a Baal Tshuva, a Baal's Tshuva, and they become a different person in their own eyes. And they're really striving to move to a new level of greatness. How important it is, number one, that we obviously don't remind the person of the past. That can be something which really borders on levels of Lashon Hara, or Nastavarim, oppression with words, as brought down in Shemiras HaLashon, the Chafetz Chaim. But I think just on a personal level, even without saying something, I think it's so important in our own mind to look at the person for whom they are now, and say, I see you for what you've become, and I respect what you've become. And somehow in our minds, we're not looking towards the past and trying to remember who that person was, or denying the person's become something because we see the past in him. If someone's really changed, really look at that person and really value the new person before us. And it might even be changing our level of behavior to some extent, and saying, wow, you really become somebody worthy of a new level of respect, and I really have to give that to you. But see somebody for what they've come. Really respect the movement in a person's life, as opposed to being locked into the way we might have perceived that person in the past. I think that's a little bit of a side message the Ibn Ezra is trying to communicate to us, and Torah is trying to communicate to us. The third reason that the Ibn Ezra expresses, and I'd like just to really focus on this one primarily, is the Ibn Ezra says, and this is reason number two, but we're saying it right now, is reason number three. The Ibn says the reason why Moshe had to grow up separate from the Jewish nation, why he had to grow up away from his brothers and sisters, he had to grow up in the palace of Paro, is a very interesting reason. And he says as follows. He says, he shouldn't have the lowliness that accustoms or accompanies someone who grows up as a slave. What does that mean? He shouldn't have the feeling of in any way a shiflus, we say, a sense of inferiority that comes from being a slave. Halotira, what do we see? The first thing we learn about Moshe Rabbeinu's life is we don't see that many stories of his early life. Really, we see a few episodes that were reintroduced to him when he's over 80. But what do we see in those early episodes? We see two things. Halotira shaharug hamitzri, b'voashu asachamas. We know that he killed an Egyptian because the Egyptian was oppressing and beating a Jew. V'hoshir benos midyan meharoim, and we see when he flees and he goes up to a place called Midyan, and he sees the daughter of Yisro and they're by the well, and the shepherds there are oppressing them. What happens? It says Hoshir benos midyan meharoim. He saves them. He's not afraid to act. But they were oppressing these shepherdesses, preventing them from getting the water that they were trying to raise from the well. So interesting. What the Ibn Ezra is telling us is the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu had to grow up outside of the house of Paro, outside of the slavery, but in the home of Paro, is that he shouldn't feel in any way the lowliness or the limitation that slavery produces. And the proof that it worked is he walks out and he sees his nation being oppressed. He sees an Egyptian beating a Jew. First thing he does is he acts. No one else was able to do that. He had a different sense of self, a different sense of confidence, a feeling that he's not afraid. There's no fear. He goes up to Midyan, and what happens? He sees the daughters of Yitro being prevented by the shepherds to get water. He acts. He takes initiative. He's not afraid to say, when I see injustice in the world, I have to do something about it. Apparently, had he grown up in the slavery of Egypt, that would not have been possible. You know, the slavery of Egypt was a very different type of slavery. The question is, how did the Egyptians succeed in really enslaving so many members of the Jewish nation? In fact, we said that 1/5 of the Jewish people came out. We counted Chumshin. The Russian said 1/5, and we know that is approximately 5 million. Those 5 million we know stood at Har Sinai and received the Torah. But it means that 4/5 died in Egypt. Some saying the plague of the Choshech, the plague of darkness, they weren't worthy to come out. But if 5 million came out and 4/5 didn't come out, it means that there were 20 million Jews, or 20 million descendants of Yaakov, who died in Egypt. That means at one point in Mitzrayim, we numbered close to 25 million. That's a nation. That's an army. How did the Egyptians succeed in enslaving this type of large number of people like that? And the Jewish nation, we know that we're an Am Shi'aref, we're stubborn people, we're stiff-necked people. We have a side to us which is so holy and so can even be strong and fearsome. We know that once we had an army, what we're capable of doing. How did they succeed in enslaving us? So the answer is something very fascinating. They used something which we call psychological warfare. Psychological warfare means they didn't need barbed wire, they didn't need fences, they didn't need dogs, they didn't need guard towers, all the entrappings in which we envision concentration camps in Europe and in the Shoah. What they did was something even more successful to some extent. They made us think that we can't be anything but slaves. They took away our ability to look at ourselves and say there could be greatness within us. That's called psychological slavery. And that type of oppression is even more difficult to combat and even more difficult to escape from than barbed wire and watchtowers and machine guns and dogs, because they basically told us and insinuated to us, we are what we are only slaves. We're limited. Don't think you can be more than exactly who you are. And that's a psychological warfare. And it must have been enormously successful, because to take 25 million descendants of Yaakov, Jews, and keep them confined in that limited setting, In fact, the word Mitzrayim, we know the word Mitzrayim is from the word tsar. Tsar in Hebrew means narrow. It was a place of narrowness. It was a place of restriction. It was a place of limitation. And really at its core and its essence of limitation, which they expressed is, all you can be is who you are. You can't be anything greater than what you are. When that message is given over, that's a very damaging message. And that's a message that could cause a human being to say, yes, I'm only a slave. I can't even strive or desire to achieve something more than that. It was a place of sorrow, a place of narrowness. He said that Paro succeeded in that goal. By the way, the Zohar says that even the name Paro speaks to that idea. The name Paro is from the word lifroa. The Mesilas Yesharim brings us down the name of the Zohar, that lifroa, Paro, lifroa comes the word to bother or to annoy. They kept us so busy, they bothered us. They made the women do the men's work, the men do the women's work which we weren't suited for, which broke us because we didn't seek success or accomplishment. And as a result, it provoked and enhanced the sense of absolute limitation. I cannot be more than what I am. So the Ibn Ezra points out to us, it was so important for Moshe Rabbeinu to grow up in an environment where he felt no limitation. Because the vision and the mission of a Jewish leader is to inspire the people to say that you can rise above yourself. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu had to grow up and be raised in a place where he felt that everything is possible. What better place than to grow up in the home, the ward, the stepson, step-grandson, as it were, of the most powerful man in Egypt and maybe the most powerful man in the world of that time. He had to grow up in a place where he felt absolutely no limitation, where anything is possible. And of course, as we mentioned, he expressed that as soon as he saw an Egyptian oppressing a Jew, he went out, he acted. He wasn't afraid. He understood, I don't have to be, victimization is not part of my vocabulary. I have to do. He sees the daughters of Yisro. I have to rescue them. I have to save them. If they're shepherds who are oppressing them, I have to scatter them. That was a function of growing up in a place where he did not see restriction or limitation. And to be a Jewish leader, that's the most important message a Jewish leader needs to give over. To let people know that you can attain greatness. You're not trapped in who you are. You can be much greater than you can imagine. In fact, that's the job of a teacher. That's the job of a rabbi. That's the job of a parent. That's the job of a good friend. To inspire somebody to say, you can be greater than what you are. In fact, the Medrash says it so beautifully. The Medrash says that there's no blade of grass that grows without an angel that hits it and says, grow, gadel. What does that mean? It probably doesn't mean that there's a little angel standing on top of it. But what it does mean that even a blade of grass, in order to achieve something greater, needs to be shown a vision of what it could be. It needs something. It needs that angel on top of it saying, hitting it and saying, you can be greater than this, grow. Don't be confined to what you think you are. There's more to you. Grow. If a blade of grass needs that angel inspiring it, how much more so does every human being need that? And that's the job of a teacher. And that's the job of a rabbi, that's the job of a parent, that's the job of a friend. And that's the job of ourselves, to tell us and give ourselves that message that we can be more than we can possibly imagine. And for this reason, Moshe Rabbeinu had to grow up in a place where he understood that there is no limitation. He couldn't be affected or infected by the slavery. He had to grow up outside of it. And that's what the Ibn Ezra is teaching us. So 3 reasons we have right now for why Moshe Rabbeinu had to grow up in the palace. Number 1, he had to learn leadership. What better place than the home of the most powerful leader of the generation? He had to grow up in a place where people saw him as being something special, not amongst them. They had to look at him and see such awe in him. And number 3, he had to grow up in a place where he himself did not feel limited, where he wasn't a victim of the psychological slavery, which tried to confine the Tsar, the Mitzrayim, which tried to say, all you are is what you are, there's nothing more. To inspire the nation, he had to go up somewhere else. So that's one lesson that we learn from the life of Moshe, which I think is a very practical lesson, and it's a very important idea. This idea, in order to grow and to become who we're supposed to be, we have to understand there's a greatness inside of ourselves. We can't sell ourselves short. We have to see that what we can be is much beyond what we can imagine, and have to find ways to bring that out of ourselves, and to find teachers that will inspire it, friends that will inspire it, and of course to be able to try to encourage ourselves and inspire ourselves through with that message of how great we can be. Two other things we learned about Moshe Rabbeinu. When we look at his life, we understand that Moshe seems to have had a speech impediment. He couldn't speak well. And that seems to be a very important idea in who he is. We look at Midrashim early on, and we see that there's some ideas in these stories that seem to attribute it to, at one point, Paro questions his loyalty, and they put before him coal and diamonds. And if he was going to take the diamonds, it would show that perhaps he's not loyal to Paro and wants to take over at one point, or he takes the hot coal, it means he is loyal to Paro. So the Medrash says he's reaching for the diamonds, and an angel hits his hand and pushes it towards the hot coal, and he puts it in his mouth, and he burns his tongue. And there's certainly a Medrash that we give over to our children, and there might be some truth in it, obviously. However, the deeper sources go for something else, and the Maharal Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy, the great rabbi of Prague throughout the 17th century, throughout the 1600s, the Maharal Prague in the Gvuras Hashem, in the 18th chapter, he offers a deeper insight into what it means that Moshe Rabbeinu had a speech impediment. So the way he explains it is in a very interesting way. He says that if you think about speech a little bit, speech is something which takes an idea, but in order to bring it out into the world, you have to limit the idea. In other words, you can have a very deep thought in your mind and your heart, but once you put words around it, then one's taken that idea and in some ways has confined it, has put a border around it, has put a boundary around it. Of course, that's necessary. We need to communicate ideas. We need to shape our thoughts, and many times when we shape our thoughts, that's the way we give them meaning, and we understand and get more clarity. But if we think about it on a very deep level, when you take an idea and you put words around it, in some way there's a limitation there. I'll just give you just a few examples. Sometimes you might have an artist. I had a friend who was an artist, and he's somebody who does what we call modern art, and very successful, does modern art and photography, and different types of paintings. And some of his work has even appeared in the Guggenheim, the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan. And we were very close. And he'd always try to tell me what he does, and I never really understood it fully, how he does it, what he does, and how he creates on canvas. All I knew was that these paintings appeared in probably the most illustrious, prestigious art museum for modern art, maybe in the world, the Guggenheim. So I remember one time I was reading an article about him in a magazine called Photography Today. And I was reading the magazine, and the magazine started describing what he does. And he said that the work of Marty Bernstein is he takes light and color and he combines it and he shapes it, and was using all this deep terminology and how he delves into the essence behind the matter, and using words that were trying to give meaning to what his art was trying to produce. And I read it and I was pretty intrigued by it, to see that description of it. I thought it was a very eloquent description. And I remember I went to him and I said to him, Marty, I read that article about you in Photography Today, and I finally understand what you do. And he looks at me and goes, you understood what that said? He goes, I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I couldn't understand a word of it. I had no idea what the guy was writing. So I remember thinking about that and understanding something, that the artist sometimes has a vision of what he wants to do, but he can't put words around it. He can't limit that vision with a description. The art critic is trying to give meaning and give shape to it and trying to help it along. But the artist at his core just knows what he does intuitively, and words take away from his vision. And therefore my friend just really didn't even get those words describing his own work. He had no idea what they were saying. Couldn't relate to it. Like, what's he trying to say? I don't know what he's trying to say. I do it, but I'm not sure what I do or how I do it. It comes through. Moshe Rabbeinu's mission, it was to connect to God fully, to have that complete connection with Hashem. The closer you are to the source, the more difficult it is to shape and give words to what you're experiencing. So the Maharal states and expresses from deeper sources that Moshe Rabbeinu's speech impediment was really a function of his greatness. His greatness was that he was able to connect to Hashem so deeply, but therefore to take that connection and confine it in space through words was something which is enormously challenging for him. And as a result, he needed an Aaron. He needed an art critic, as it were. He needed someone to take him and to bring him down another step so that people could understand it and connect to it. But his speech impediment, interestingly, really wasn't a function of a deficiency. His speech impediment really was a function of his greatness. His greatness was that he had such a deep connection with Hashem, a connection really which could not be limited by speech. And as a result, he really couldn't bring it down to his own speech and needed a secondary source, Aaron, to bring it down. But again, I think the idea speaks and is consistent to who Moshe Rabbeinu was. His message and his mission to the Jewish nation was to let them know there is no limitation. You have to understand that you have a greatness which can't be confined. And his whole being expressed that. His limitation in words was a function of the fact that there was no limitation in who he was. He was able to connect to Hashem in such a deep source, in such a deep way, that to shape it and limit it through a word was something that he was not really able to do. I heard once that there was a great rabbi, Rabbi Simcha Tzvi Broida. He was the Alter in Kelm, great yeshiva of Kelm in the early part of the 20th century. And he once, they say, had a thought. And he had a thought that he didn't express for over 20 years because he was concerned once he places words around that thought, there's going to be a limitation in that thought. I didn't want to limit it. So it took him 20 years to come up with the proper way, feeling, syntax, terminology, words, mode of expression in order to bring that idea out. Because he knew that a word would limit it. I think it's true in general in life. I think we see that sometimes we understand that less words really communicate ideas more than many words. Sometimes we, in the relationships which are the deepest and the most meaningful to us in life, and sometimes it just really comes down to the most simple words of "I love you," and words of poetry or words which try to be more elaborate than that take away from really the core and the heart and the emotion of what's going on. Not to say that's the time we don't have to speak it out, we do. But I think on some level we have to understand, like Moshe Rabbeinu, that words can limit. And therefore, his inability to speak was a function of his greatness and was a function of the message that he needed to convey to the Jewish nation, which was there's no confinement or limitation on how great you can be. And that had to be given over to the Jewish people. That is the message of a Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the message of a rabbi. That's the message of a teacher. That's the message of a parent. That's the message of a friend. You have to let someone know there's no end to what you can achieve. So what do we see with Moshe Rabbeinu? We know the way he spoke. The Talmud says something so interesting to us. It also told us what he wore. We have to know what Moshe Rabbeinu wore, his clothing. why is knowing his clothing something which is significant to us? So let me tell you what the Gemara says. The Talmud says, what did Moshe Rabbeinu wear? It says in the Gemara in Ta'anit, Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis, 11 Amud Beis, it said, "B'ma shimesh Moshe." What did Moshe used to wear when he used to do his service? It says, "B'chalak levan she'ein lo imra." He used to wear a white cloak, she'ein lo imra. A white cloak, it says, that didn't have a hem. What's a hem? A hem we know is the part of our garment that closes it at the end, whether it be on pants or a skirt or a jacket. A white cloak that didn't have a hem. So again, the Maral Prague asked the question, like, what do we need these details in Moshe's life? Why do we have to know what he wore? There's a white cloak, it didn't have a hem. Like, what's the significance? What's the deeper meaning in that statement? Why do we have to know exactly what he's doing? What's that all about? So he says so beautifully. He says, number one, what's the idea of wearing a white cloak? You know, white for us, especially when one is doing a service of Hashem, white isn't a natural color in many ways. You know, think about the Pesach Seder, we wear our kittles, which are white, and at the same time we're eating wine, drinking wine, and eating matzah, and doing everything that we can do to get a white kittel very, very messy. Yet we wear white. Why? Because we want to show at the Pesach Seder that the whole coming out of Egypt was above nature. And we're going to be above nature. We're going to wear white, even though right now is not the right time to wear white. We should be wearing dark colors, so it shouldn't get all disfigured and discolored and dirty. You know, I was once told by a teacher of mine, a very great rabbi, he said to me that whenever you do a wedding, make sure you always use white wine under the chuppah, not red wine. And we thought, oh, that must be very deep significance. He said, no, very practical reason, because if it spills, it shouldn't get the Kala's gown dirty. You know, all she needs is red stains on her dress for the pictures. Use white wine. It's just as good. But Moshe Rabbeinu is wearing white. The idea of white is always the idea that he's doing something which is a little bit above this world. White gets dirty. If you're engaged in this world, don't wear white. And again, the mission of Moshe Rabbeinu is to say you have to have a vision that goes beyond this world, above nature. Strive for something above yourself. And finally, it says that this garment didn't have an imra, didn't have a hem. What's that all about? An imra. First of all, the word for hem in Hebrew is spelled Aleph Mem, Resh Aleph, Imra, or Amra. It sounds exactly like another word we know in the Hebrew language, Amar, which means speech, or to say. He wore a garment that didn't have an imra, didn't have a hem. Well, what does a hem do to a garment? A hem limits it. A hem takes a flowing garment that wants to keep going on and on and on and says there's a limitation. It has to stop right there. In fact, we didn't have a hem on our pants would drag down into the mud. But Moshe Rabbeinu's garment, there's no hem, there's no limitation. Because even when people looked at him, they had to see this idea that you don't have to stop. There's no outer limit. There's a greatness that can keep going and going and going. And how interesting it is, by the way, the word imrahem is the same root as amra, which means speech. Because just as a hem limits the garment, as we were mentioning before, speech limits the concept of the idea. But Moshe Rabbeinu's garment could not have an imra, could not have a hem. Just like his speech couldn't have a limitation. There had to be difficulty in his bringing the idea out because he was so close to the source. But I think the message that is being conveyed is that Moshe Rabbeinu's job vis-a-vis the Jewish nation was to teach this most foundational and fundamental concept that in order to achieve greatness, you have to know that there's no limit to what you can become. There's no limit in who you are. You can't be confined by yourself. You have to see yourself as somebody who could be much, much more than you can ever imagine. And that's the message that Moshe Rabbeinu had to teach the Jewish nation. And that's probably the most important message that we all need to hear. Is probably the message of our generation for sure. We live in a world today which so much, I think, takes away from what we call in Hebrew the Gadlut Adam, the greatness of what we can be. To end on a thought, I heard once that teacher in Yerushalayim, Shlomo Vogel, once said, he said, if you think about the 20th century, there are three philosophies in the 19th century that really influenced it. There was Marx, there was Darwin, there was Freud. So if you analyze those philosophies a little bit, you think about it a little bit, you say, well, what did Karl Marx say? He said, well, the essence of man is what he can produce in terms of capital production, and communism was the direct result. You think about Freud came up with all sorts of ideas about the subconscious affecting the human being, actually ideas which were influenced to some extent by his connection with the Friedrich Lubavitcher Rebbe. And Darwin came up with the idea, or is attributed to Darwin's thinking process, that we evolved from the animal. So Vogel once said that you think about 20th century man, we walked in from the 1900s into the 20th century with the following self-perception. What am I? Well, Karl Marx says I'm a machine. Sigmund Freud says I'm like one big id, these dark forces that influence me. And Charles Darwin says I'm an ape. I'm a machine, I'm an id, and I'm an ape. Where in that description do we see the essence of what the human being is that we're created in the divine image. Maybe it's no wonder that the 20th century saw more mass murder between World War I and World War II than any other time in human history. When we lose sight of who we are and the greatness that we can be, it's impossible to fulfill the divine mission. Moshe Rabbeinu, as our teacher, that was his message to us. You have to know you can be great. You have to know there's no limitation. That's who he was in his speech. That's who he was in his dress. That's the reason why Hashem caused him to grow up in the house of Paro, in order to be able to communicate this message to the Jewish nation. No limitation. Greatness is all yours for the taking. I'm going to stop here right now. I ask everybody to invite everybody to continue to join us on Tuesdays for our Lunch and Learns. And if you have any questions, we'll open up for questions right now. Or if you want to comment on the WhatsApp chat, you're more than welcome to do that, or to text me privately. I'd be happy to answer, or if you'd like to share with the group as well.